Hey everyone, this is Tammy Painter and you're listening to the Book Owl Podcast. The podcast where we talk very seriously about books and literature and thematic elements. No, I'm kidding. This is the podcast where I entertain your inner book nerd with tales of quirky books and literary lore. Alright, my little ghosts and goblins. This episode is coming out just a couple days before the haunting holiday of Halloween, which means I'm required by podcast law to feature something spooky. As if we Americans aren't already fearful enough over the upcoming election, right? Anyway, I already had an idea for this episode kind of floating around in my brain, but then Helen Crawford, who is not only a listener, but she's also the lead monster maker over at Crawcraft's Beasties, she stepped in and said, "What about an episode on haunted bookstores?" I thought it was brilliant. Unfortunately, it turned out that there really aren't many interesting tales of haunted bookshops. I mean, there were a few haunted bookstores, but it was more just like quips about cold spots in the building or the occasional book falling off a shelf. There really weren't any real stories behind the stories. But the lack of bookstore ghosts didn't stop my search, because it turns out that just like in the movie Ghostbusters, ghosts would rather spend their time browsing and sometimes wreaking havoc in the stacks of their local libraries. And let me tell you, there turned out to be an overwhelming number of library hauntings. But I've picked out a few of my favorite, and some of the funniest, and some of the creepiest ones to share with you. And if you're on the Book Owl Podcast newsletter, as your bonus trick or treat this time around, you'll get links to all the ones I had to skip over. And that also means this is the perfect time to mention that if you aren't already signed up to the newsletter, there's going to be a link in the show notes for you to sign up. You'll not only get bonus content with each episode, but you'll also get a little owl-themed gift just for joining the flock. Alright, on to the episode and to 10 spooky libraries for your Halloween haunts. So, since Helen is from Ireland, I thought it would only be appropriate if we start with a haunted library from the Emerald Isle, and that library would be Marsh's library, which, the more I read about it, might just deserve its own full episode. This gorgeous book palace was founded in 1701 by Archbishop Narcissus Marsh, which makes him sound like a Harry Potter character. And this was the first public library in all of Ireland. Well, Marsh had a niece who he had raised and who he just absolutely adored like his own daughter. And she started a relationship with a salty sea captain, and Marsh vehemently opposed this relationship. But the niece couldn't help it. She was in love, and she eloped with her captain, leaving behind a note for her uncle telling him what she had done. Of course, she didn't want to be found out and stopped before the two got properly hitched, so she hid the note in a book. In a library. Marsh never did find the note, and I'm not quite sure how he was supposed to know the note even existed, but after his death in 1713, something was seen wandering through the gallery, rummaging through book after book in search of the letter. And supposedly, if you move between one gallery of the library to another, you can feel a spectral chill. Ooh. Alright, hopping now over to Norfolk, England. Well, this ghost story really drives home the stereotype of the British stiff upper lip, keep calm, carry on mentality. So we're heading to the library of Felbrigg Hall. In the 1970s, the estate was acquired by the National Trust, and it was up to David Muffin to put the place in order. So, one evening, okay, it could have been daytime, but evening makes it spookier. I'm not sure whether it was day or night. But anyway, one evening, David is at a desk in the library, and he happens to notice someone in a chair by the fireplace reading some books. Then the someone finished his reading and faded away. Okay, at this point, even as a skeptic, I'd be letting out a horror movie scream and dashing the hell out of there. But not David. He just shrugs his shoulders and continues about his work. Then, later, he asks the butler if the house has any ghosts. To which the butler says, "Oh, sure, we've got William Wyndham III, who likes to read by the fireplace." The butler found this so normal, he even set out books for the ghost to read, and it turns out Ghost William favored works by his old friend Samuel Johnson. Talk about a lifelong fan. Or is that an after-lifelong fan? Anyway, so let's jump across the pond because it turns out American ghosts really love their libraries. Now, as some of you know, Mr. Husband works at a library, and there's a kind of an ongoing joke that once you get a job at the library, you don't leave. Turns out that might be very true because I think at least a third of the stories I read were about ghosts of former library workers, most of whom liked to push books onto the floor. Which I'm sure after a lifetime of having to keep those shelves tidy and neat means they are having a ball in their afterlife. Mr. Husband also tells the occasional story of a few rare, troublesome patrons, but in most cases, these folks leave the library premises when asked. Not so much in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania at Lay University's Linderman Library. See, they used to have this old man who came to the library and he was a real nuisance. Not one to let a little death stop his crabby ways, he is now haunting the library and continues to pester students and staff. And speaking of naughty ghosts, over in Tarrytown, New York, not long after his death, Washington Irving, who is the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, began haunting the library of his former home. The trouble is, unlike William Wyndham, Irving isn't there for the books. He's there because the home has kind of become a little bit of a tourist attraction, and, well, he likes to pinch the bottoms of female visitors. Cheeky little ghost. So let's get into the creepy side of the stacks. Over at the Sweetwater County Library in Wyoming, ever since the library opened in 1980, lights have been seen flipping on and off, and strange sounds reverberate through the building at night. In rooms with no windows, glowing dots are seen to flicker across the walls. See, it turns out the city planners didn't pay attention to their horror film tropes and built the library over a freaking graveyard. This graveyard had been the burial place mainly for Asian railroad workers, and the graves had supposedly all been moved in the 1920s. Supposedly. Because in 1985, they found one remaining coffin. Yeah, I'm out of the Sweetwater Library already, but for those of you sticking around, it gets even more eerie. See, kids, there used to be these things called typewriters, and the library had them for typing up forms and documents. But on occasion, the typewriters would type on their own. The library staff tried inserting paper to see if the ghosts had a message to convey, but the specters refused to commit anything to paper. Actually, pretty smart, that. But wait, there's more, because the creepy crawlies aren't done yet. So once the library did get computers, there was one that was a closed system, meaning it had no external inputs. And because of what it was used for, it also had no word processor on it. The librarian using it one day turned her back, and when she turned back around, her name was typed in large letters across the screen. Again, no external input, no word processing program. I'm starting to scare myself here. All right, speaking of typewriters, over at the Old Palace Theater branch of the Arkansas Saline County Library, employees have heard phantom footsteps, slamming doors, books falling from shelves, and paperback carousels rotating on their own. And, working late one night, director Julie Hart heard the distinctive sound of a manual typewriter. Trouble is, the library had gotten rid of all their typewriters years ago. Damn, typewriters are scary. So we're up to number 7 now, and this one isn't super creepy, but it does prove that if you name your kid Millicent, you're just asking her to eventually become a ghost. So the founder of Fairhaven's Millicent Library was Standard Oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers. His daughter Millicent died of heart failure in 1890 when she was only 17, and he named the library after her. And of course, she began haunting it. Patrons have seen her glowing blue form walking the halls, and at night, after the library's closed, people have reported seeing a girl standing in the window of the turret that makes up the front part of the building. But Millicent isn't lonely in her afterlife. She's also hanging out with a woman in black who runs her fingers along the spines of the shelved books. And there's also a man dressed in a tweed jacket, small circular glasses, and a purple bow tie, don't know why, who mops the basement floor. And I also don't know why he does that either. That seems like a really lame afterlife. Okay, ready for another creepy one? How about another horror movie classic, The Evil Curse? And you'll find that over at the Peoria Public Library. See, the land the library was built on was once owned by Mary Stevenson Gray, and I don't know if she hated libraries or just had a really bad experience with a librarian, but in 1847 she pronounced a curse on anyone who occupied her land when she died. And if you don't believe curses are real, well, 3 library directors have already met untimely ends due to this curse. There's E.S. Wilcox, who in 1915 was run over by a streetcar. There's Samuel Patterson Prowse, who was doing nothing more exciting than attending a library board meeting in 1921 when he suffered a fatal heart attack. And in 1924, director Dr. Edwin Wiley committed suicide by taking arsenic. Now, I don't know if the Peoria Library is covering something up, but since those deaths, supposedly no other library directors have died under mysterious circumstances. Are you buying that? I don't know. And if an evil curse wasn't enough, the employees also report seeing the ghost of Prowse hanging around the basement. Alright, enough with creepy. It's time to get to number 9 and my second favorite story, which is kind of funny and also kind of sad. So, the front portion of the current Old Bernardsville Public Library in New Jersey was once the Vealtown Tavern during the Revolutionary War. The innkeeper's daughter was Phyllis Parker, who was in love with a British spy. And the spy, he was caught and hanged in 1777. And to make sure Phyllis didn't forget her transgression, the body was delivered in a coffin to the tavern. Phyllis saw the coffin and she suffered a nervous breakdown, and she was just never the same again. Then, starting in 1974, the ghost of Phyllis began showing up in the rooms of the library where the tavern once was. But she was a good ghost who never caused any trouble and seemed to be a welcome addition. So much so that they issued her her own library card. Despite this, Phyllis slowly stopped making appearances, and one of the last times she was seen was in November of 1989, when a 3-year-old boy saw a lady in a long white dress in the reading room. But this kid, he wasn't put off one bit. He actually stopped and said hello to the nice lady. And I don't know, maybe Phyllis knew her time was up because only a couple years after this final appearance, the library was scheduled to move to a new location. And now, I've saved my favorite ghostly tale for last. And this tale really does have a tail because it's about a ghost cat. Unless, of course, that cat was a Manx, but that was never stated in anything I found. So, anyway, this is at the Doris and Harry Vise Library at Tennessee's Cumberland University. And in March 2001, the director of the library, John Boniel, said a cat came floating across his office floor. He said it definitely wasn't walking, it was gliding, and none of the feet touched the ground. It then, after crossing his office, vanished into the boxes that were under his desk, which actually does sound like your typical cat. But the cat, even though it's my favorite, isn't the only ghost at the Vise Library. John also has reported eerie sensations in certain rooms, and a former librarian used to play peekaboo with the ghost of a little girl. And I'm not sure if that's creepy or just says a lot about what it takes to get through a slow day in library land. So, now it's your turn. What about your area? Are there any haunted libraries you know of? Have you felt any icy fingers tickling your spine while you roam the stacks? I want to hear your spooky tales, so let me know using the contact information you'll find in the show notes. So now's the time in the podcast when I give you a few little updates. As for writing, as I record this, I'm about halfway through the first draft of the 3rd book of my Cassie Black Trilogy, and by the time this releases, I'm hoping I'll be almost done with that draft. I'm really pushing to get the book and the entire trilogy completely revised and edited by the end of the year, and I think I'm going to be cutting it pretty close, but it will be nice to have them all put together and ready to publish in the first part of 2021. And as for the podcast, well, there's not really much to report here. I just want to say thanks to everyone who has been commenting on the episodes using the comment form on the blog posts. And as ever, if there's a strange bookstore, a quirky author, or other book-related topic you want covered, don't be shy about letting me know. Okay, everyone, that is it for this episode. If no ghosts and goblins snatch you up at your local library, I will hoot at you next time. The Book Owl Podcast is a production of Daisy Dog Media, copyright 2020, all rights reserved. The theme music was composed by Kevin MacLeod. Audio processing by ophonic.com.